Hi, my name is Greg Barnheisel. I'm from Duquesne University. Modernism came from cities. Paris, London, obviously, New York, of course. I'll give you Chicago, Mexico City. But for my money, the real cradle of modernism is Pittsburgh. Brooklyn Bridge, the Empire State Building, that steel came from here. The American labor movement, here. Gail Rogers mentioned on Thursday that Pittsburgh had the first Nickelodeon, and that's true, but it also had the first radio station. Pittsburgh, in fact, was the place where safe consumer electricity was developed at Westinghouse Labs over east of the city. And then there's the people. Gertrude Stein, Mary Cassatt, Martha Graham, Kenneth Burke, Malcolm Cowley, all from Pittsburgh. Now, to be fair, they all got out of here as quickly as they could. But what great modernist hero doesn't have to flee home in order to achieve greatness? I would even argue that Pittsburgh is responsible for the death of modernism by loosing Andy Warhol upon the world. Certainly, after this conference, you will all be returning home and rewriting all of your lesson plans and your articles to reflect your newfound recognition that Pittsburgh is the axis around which modernism rotates. Given this, I know I speak for the organizers of this conference in saying, you're welcome. And Boston, consider this a challenge. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the final evening session of MSA 16. We thank all of you sincerely for coming to Pittsburgh and sharing this amazing experience with us. Some of you have come from as far away as Japan. That's just amazing. I don't think that our graduate student organizers are ever going to be the same after this. But as I've told them, I think a shock of gray hair is actually quite fetching. I also want to thank again our major sponsors, Duquesne University and the University of Pittsburgh, and again to express our fulsome gratitude to the graduate student volunteers from Duquesne and from Pitt and from West Virginia University, and to the consummately professional staff of the Omni Hotel. We really are grateful to all of those people. Although I'm sure she will provide a high point, Meta DuEwa Jones' brilliant talk will not mark the end of this conference. And we look forward to seeing you at the reception immediately following, as well as at the 2 panel sessions tomorrow morning. And the reading tonight. But I've rambled on too long, and as my mother would say, it's time to move forward into this evening. I'm particularly proud to call to the podium Dr. Emily Rudder, who will introduce Dr. Jones. It was only a few months ago that I was introducing Emily when she won graduate student awards for research and teaching while she was a doctoral student at Duquesne University. And now I have the pleasure of introducing her as an assistant professor at Oberlin College with a pretty serious scholarly record already. Emily?
Thanks, Greg. So it is my pleasure, I'm truly honored to introduce Meta DuEwa Jones tonight. Meta is currently Associate Professor of African American Literature at Howard University. She previously taught at the University of Texas, Austin. And she's received several fellowships, including a Rockefeller Fellowship and a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. Her ambitious and eloquent 2011 book, The Muse is Music, Jazz Poetry from the Harlem Renaissance to Spoken Word, received honorable mention for the MLA's William Saunders Scarborough Prize. The Muse is Music encompasses nearly a century in African American poetry and poetics, beginning with such luminaries as Langston Hughes and concluding with the hip-hop inspired poetics of our own era. The Muses' music stands as a model, I believe, for the kind of interdisciplinary inquiry that many of us are engaged in. I first encountered Meta's work as a graduate student here at Duquesne when I was investigating the ways in which music-inspired poetry functions both on and off the page, so textually innovative while also being orally and aurally provocative. And Meta's work became an inspiration, unbeknownst to her, particularly because she so deftly attends to formal strategies in jazz-inspired poetry alongside more overtly sociopolitical concerns with race, gender, and sexuality. Last fall, I had the pleasure of seeing Meta discuss visual poetics in Natasha Trethewey's Belixophilia. And I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that we eagerly await what Meta has to offer tonight. So please join me in welcoming Meta DuEwa Jones. Thanks.
So first, I want to start by thanking you all here in the audience today. It's Saturday night. It's been a fantastic conference, and I can think of a number of other kinds of evening walking tours you all could be doing in Pittsburgh, especially since we now know that it is the heartbeat of modernism, and as I will argue in my talk today, its legacies. So thank you for being here. Next, I want to thank the MSA Program Committee, particularly the host committee, Gail Rogers, Judy Suh, Greg Barnheisel, got that right. And I especially want to give thanks to Vanessa Fernandez, who picked me up in the wee hours of the evening when I arrived, and to Mary Parrish and Linda Kinahan, both for inviting me to participate in the conference, but also for helping me with logistics, and to the tech staff. It's an honor and a joy to follow after you, Rachel, and you will see, since in part of my talk I'll be talking a bit about not about the long poem, but about a poet who you know very well, who wrote a long poem, Cecil Giscombe, and we can talk about why he didn't make it to your list yesterday. That'll be in part my tribute to you. So I'll start with saying a little bit about my talk. Make it old, make it new, poetry, photography, cartography, which I added in working on it, and the legacy of Black modernisms. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is marketing the new and how that relates to ideas about Black Marxism in relationship to the old. As many of you all know in modernist studies, that kind of Michael North not only did a bit of historiography about that phrase, making it new, and pointing it out that it was actually not, the tracing of it was asynchronous with its actual attribution to Ezra Pound in terms of modernist studies, but also he followed that up with work on novelty and on the new, in which he made the argument that the new, of course, is always already circumscribed by ideas of the old. But I want to ask a slightly different question about what it means to make something new in relationship to the old, and that particularly in a way that race intersects that. So one of the ways I thought of looking through that is the way that the new is marketed through Black modernism, specifically its canons, as well as later its canon makers. So you see here, this is my small bit of tribute. My list will be a lot shorter than Rachel's was yesterday. But we start with thinking about the heartbeat of Black modernism in relationship to the Harlem Renaissance. And there was not one, but two new Negroes, right? Both those two different anthologies that themselves are marketing notions of the new. And I included the titles here because I think it's important to think about how from the very beginning, it's not just the new Negro, but the new Negro in interpretation, right? And so that the scholarly practice of interpretation is the lens through which the old and the new historically were marketed in Black modernism. I want to jump forward, since I'm going to be looking at modernist contemporary legacies, and move to look at some other ways that new as a concept in relationship to Blackness and its legacies has been codified or canonized. There's New Negro Poets, USA, with two, I would argue, late modernists, or as Kathy Schultz might add, Afro-modernist poets, Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks, who in New Negro Poets USA looked backward and forward. Then you have, interestingly enough, the new Black poetry. So it seems that within only 5 short years, that kind of radical break between the Negro and the Black American took place, judging just by publishing nomenclature. Then you jump just a few years forward to understanding the new Black poetry, and again, you can see at the same time that the editorial moved to canonize notions of the new in relationship to Blackness, the scholarly enterprise was always involved within that. And then Natural Process, one of those anthologies of Black poetry that is sometimes forgotten, whose subtitle anthology of the new Black poetry also makes reference to it. Now, where I'm going in my direction for today's talk that will shift a bit differently is how the new appears, not necessarily, I'll say a little bit about how it appears in an anthology edited by Kevin Young, Giant Steps, the new generation of African-American writers, but in things such as the new Black aesthetic in the essay form, and more specifically, the new Black in poems by one of our contemporary African-American women writers, Evie Shockley. In Kevin Young's Giant Steps, one of the title that does not have the word new in it, but definitely has the word future in it, in his The Black Psychic Hotline, or the Future of African American Writing, Young says that the future is now, and is made up in part of the writers contained here. Giant Steps features a cross-section of cutting-edge Black writers. Much like the famous New Negro anthology of the 1920s, Giant Steps highlights the present-day directions and the diversity of what many call the current Renaissance in African American letters. A question I'd like to ask here about thinking about modernism, Black modernism specifically, and its legacies of the new is, why did Young title it Giant Steps instead of titling the book itself The Black Psychic Hotline, or The Future is Now, or, in anticipation of my talk today, The New Generation, Heirs to the Black Modernist Legacy? The title, of course, pays homage, right, to John Coltrane's groundbreaking Giant Steps, which changed, as Young argues, the way we hear, but importantly also for the purposes of my talk today, the way we see. Now, it's interesting to think about that kind of, in Young's introduction, he uses sheets of sound. Of course, we're thinking about that as a material or textual metaphor, but for Young to move backwards to the New Negro anthology, jump forwards not to Black arts movement anthologies, but to music, right, to jazz, and particularly to emblems, right, such as Coltrane and Giant Steps of modern jazz, suggests that I would argue that in his particular framing of how one makes the old new in contemporary Black legacies of modernism, it's through a masculinist tradition of modernism and its legacies, right? And so what's striking to me about that is the leap that he makes across multiple decades of African-American literary expression, and it's a leap that I would argue has its roots in modernist tendencies around particular kinds of curatorial practices, right? So the modernist enterprise is a cottage industry at the turn of 2000, when Giant Steps as an anthology was published, I would argue seemed a more venerable way for Young to place himself in a lineage than at the time in 2000 when the Black arts movement was still taking a beating in terms of notions of its generative potential for contemporary African-American poets. Now, another term that Young uses in that anthology that I think is interesting, and that for different reasons I'm not going to go into in large scope today, is the term post. And at the end of his introduction to the anthology, he makes the equation and says that kind of what folk culture was to the New Negro movement writers, popular culture is to today's African American writers. Now, the thing about kind of folk culture and popular culture is that this idea of the post lending us to a notion of the popular, leaving from the folk and going to a notion of the popular, is one that I would suggest that the two of the artists that I'm going to look at today, both the aforementioned, thank you, Emily, Natasha Trethewey, as well as the poet C.S. Giscombe, are not necessarily using popular culture. And I think that generational slippage is important in the way that Young is framing them. There's another poet that I want to shift to talk about here in terms of poems, and that's Evie Shockley's The New Black. In her kind of turn, as opposed to a curatorial turn or turn to folk culture, she turns back to the silent film era in the very first poem in The New Black, which is titled My Last Modernist Poem Number 4, or Rebirth of a Nation. At the opening of stanza of that poem, Shockley writes, and I'm quoting here, quote, "A clean-cut man brings a brown blackness to a dream-carved, unprecedented place. Some see in this the end of race. This miracle marks an end like years in, the kind that whips around again and again." What's striking to me about Evie Shockley's own framing of the New Black within a notion of not an old modernism, but a sequentially and temporally last modernist poem, and she only includes one in the series. There's only one number 4. There aren't 1, 2, 3 aren't included, and that kind of elision, I think, is significant, and the kinds of elisions in the archive of that contemporary Black modernist writers are trying to kind of explore, is that whips around again and again, this cycle that repeats, this idea that kind of in trying to move forward into new ideas or new innovations in contemporary Blackness, one always must turn back around to not the end of race or the post of race, to think about the proliferation of posts that are competing, I would argue, in terms of marketing space around issues of the new in contemporary Black poetry, but also in terms of a relationship to the whip that goes around again. Right after that section that includes that poem almost as an epilogue, Evie Shockley's The New Black frames her first section of the volume with the title Out with the Old, which begins with epistolary poems, including the lost letters of Frederick Douglass. Now, one of the legacies of Black modernism that I would argue is not an investment so much in actual archives, but also an investment in fictive ones. And so, although in Shockley's case, the lost letters are actually not found letters, it's a fictive imagination, when we turn to look at Natasha Trethewey's work, which I'll do in a minute, we see that her work with fictive archives, her fictionalization of actual archives, as well as her invention of certain historical facts that take place in the archive, is a different kind of relationship to the legacies of Black modernism, in which folk culture became the archive of Black modernist representational strategies. So what I'd like to argue is that kind of just as kind of people like Melvin Tolson's kind of Harlem Gallery in Book One has a fictive curator, we see in that legacy that people like Evie Shockley, who have fictive curatorial roles in curating Douglass's letters, also end up having a communion with people like Kevin Young, who has an actual curatorial role as the literary collections specialist for the Raymond Danowski Poetry Library at Emory University. So we've come a far distance, I would argue, from the time when Langston Hughes rejoiced in his own letters about having his papers being collected in the Beinecke Library. Now, Trethewey's papers are also archived at the institution where she works. They recently were announced with great fanfare in August of this year, and I think that turn for me now to look at and talk about kind of what I am arguing is a retrospective aesthetics in African American modernist poetry has everything to do with a current institutionalization practice in contemporary Black poetry, in which I would argue that contemporary poets are very much aware of how one way to kind of have a certain kind of representational visibility is through archival practices in mainstream institutions. So there are two aspects of my case studies for today with Trethewey and with Giscombe. One aspect I would argue in terms of what I see as their retrospective aesthetics that involves both spectacle, ideas of the spectral, speculative, and speculation, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, is a formalist strand, right? A formalist modernist strand that I would argue that Natasha Trethewey represents. One that is not necessarily technically innovative in her use of the sonnet form, but is conceptually innovative in her return to, and her cycling back, I'm thinking of Shockley again and again, to ideas of the spectacle and the spectral, right? The archive that haunts contemporary Black writers in her use not only of forms, but the subjects of her forms. The other is a strand, which I would argue is a Black modernism of the avant-garde that C.S. Giscombe represents. In both cases, Giscombe and Trethewey both work in different ways with approaches to the lyric, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about in Q&A about an oblique relationship to modernist traditions and its legacies that each holds. There are two reasons that I placed these two different writers together, not just kind of because they're generationally different, but because they both are dealing with archives in a different way. So Trethewey turns to the archive of E.J. Belloc, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but specifically she's working with women who are putatively, quote unquote, anonymous. They were known certainly to their relatives and to their customers in New Orleans, but although the women themselves were anonymous, the place, the spatialization of their houses in the Bordello in New Orleans and in Storyville are quite famous. She's placing her archive within a relationship to the archive of photography at the turn of the century, and her relationship to a clear ekphrastic tradition, her book meditates on these archives, I would argue, is one of the ways that there's a shift from the kind of representational strategies of the new that we saw in Stephen Henderson's understanding the new Black poetry, Black music, and Black speech as poetic references to ones that kind of drown out considerations, and deliberately so, of Black music and Black speech. So throughout Belloc's Ophelia, there are no blues or jazz poems. There's only one small reference to professor, right, working up a frenzy at the piano. And so I would argue that kind of for Trethewey, this turn to, this ekphrastic turn is something that is a key legacy of Black modernism that I think most contemporary and many contemporary Black writers, having not necessarily exhausted jazz and blues, so I'm not necessarily repudiating the work I did in the Muse is music, but having discovered that there's a way in which the kind of enclosures of jazz and blues tend to drown out our ability actually to see, have a tendency to try to put music at a distance. C.S. Giscombe, by contrast, is dealing with a very named place, like Giscombe is all over the place in British Columbia, as we'll see when I continue, but he's dealing with not an anonymous person, but a place, Giscombe, British Columbia, which is a small sawmill town not very far from the province of Prince George, that is not necessarily known. Now, Giscombe deliberately works with the absence of photographs of his putative ancestor, John Robert Giscombe, and it is the absence, not the presence, of photographs in the archive that propels him, and that propels him specifically in the direction of mapping and of cartography. A legacy of formalist modernisms. Natasha Trethewey's photographic forms of enclosure. Form is a capacious and charged term, one that's elicited lively debates about its capacity for identifying distinct hybrid genres or texts. Like genre and like text, Modernist forms and Black modernist forms harbor a multitude of meanings in English language and literature, commonly including shape, what can be seen or felt, as in the body of something natural, mechanical, or artistic, or even something artificial. Forms artifice, like the artifice of the archive that's fictionalized by Trethewey, can be paradoxical. Historically, form also connoted natural beauty or the body beautiful. When an artist engages in style, styling, or profiling their elements of form, that artist's unique signature, her profile, is referenced to being as, quote unquote, in rare form. Profile, form, each hold attendant associations with visibility, biography, portraiture, and even policing that varied forms of profile can procure. In Natasha Trethewey's Bellocophilia, Trethewey explores, or more precisely, sightsees terms of racial inscription that seek to deform the humanity and distort the history of African Americans or mixed race persons. She engages in a tradition of the Black modernist tradition of the mulatto iconography, but by doing so through articulating a complex understanding of linguistic, racial, and familial inheritance. As a quote-unquote white father's Black daughter, end quote, her poetry decries, quote, words that shadow us, words that take shape outside us, end quote, such as mulattoes, half-breed, and zebra, that, quote, name us as other or different and less than. Modernist language is modernist form. As such, Trethewey, an heir to its legacy, contrasts such historical and linguistic deformation, the primitivism that attended to certain kinds of fetishization of mulatto iconography, not as was suggested in the Crisis magazine or by Elaine Locke and W.B. Du Bois and others, by offering putatively positive, quote unquote, images as counter to a racist taxonomy. And one can imagine if Du Bois was alive today, what he might say about a book project about sex workers set in New Orleans. But instead, I would argue that Trethewey exposes the process of seeing Blackness as the central problem. And in this, I'm trying to argue that one of the legacies of Black modernism for contemporary writers is looking more at formal issues of process in relationship to kind of uncovering and working through archives, as opposed to just kind of the product of what it means to see or to stereotype Blackness. A troubling vision is manifest throughout Bellocophilia. Ophelia is an imagined persona who is based on a composite series of photographs circa 1912 by E.J. Belloc, later collected in the book Storyville Portraits. The book's epigraph describes her as a, quote, very white-skinned Black woman, a very white-skinned Black woman who would have lived in one of the few colored brothels such as Lulu White's Mahogany Hall. Learning about the house itself, Trethewey notes, I realized something about the racial identities of many of Belloc's subjects. Lulu White housed mixed-race women in her Mahogany Hall, and in 1912 New Orleans, blacks belonged to women in a category with all people of African descent. White New Orleanians demanded a kind of racial segregation that would treat anyone with so much of a trace of African blood as inferior. Trethewey's character here embodies the troubling mediation of visual, racial, sexual, and juridically spatial forms that keep her enclosed within a photograph, a book, or bordello, or a limiting look. As Annette Debo has insightfully argued, the sex industry is as much, quote, about theatricality as it is about sex, and in Bellocophilia, the act of looking is layered, circular, and reflexive. These layers of looking are not only complicated by the racial and gender identity of each person looking, and the way in which people are trained to look at others, end quote, but also, I would add, by the spectral qualities, the retrospective qualities of looking that Trethewey's engagement in the archive entails. Racialization, for instance, requires Ophelia to avert her gaze. I walk these streets a white woman, or so I think, until I catch the eyes of some stranger upon me, and I must lower mine, a negress, again. Unable to secure a modest position in the bustling offices where she seeks work, Ophelia accepts an immodest position with the multiple layers that that word implies: labor, place, posture, a situation. In a dramatic monologue, quote, Countess P's Advice for New Girls, Ophelia describes her indoctrination into the troubling visual protocols of the sex work industry through the perspective of the Countess. The Countess instructs Ophelia, quote, for our customers, you must learn to be watched. And later, she states, quote, let him see whatever he needs. Train yourself not to look back. She's exposed to customers who come to, quote, see the spectacle, Black women with white skin, exotic curiosities. The thing about this focus that Trethewey has through the character and the composite character of Ophelia on Black women and white skin connects to Anne Chang's work on the fetishization of Black skin and focus on the modern surface, and that's the connection to racial primitivism. The question I'd like to ask is, what does it mean for writers such as Trethewey to be looking and for us to look at her looking in a contemporary turn? We're not in the moment of 1910. We're only historically, retrospectively looking at that. The answer that I might argue is that Trethewey's looking is also at the same time a form of looking away. Ophelia, for instance, later follows the madam's advice. She actually doesn't look back. In another poem, she speaks of a customer who, quote, wore a monocle, moved in close, end quote, inspecting her face for evidence of race that would make her worth the fee. In turn, Ophelia, quote, looks away, seeing her reflection, small and distorted, in Belloc's lens. Thereby, Trethewey challenges viewers to recognize the spectator's role in caging Black women through antiquated and erroneous racial associations. But how antiquated are those associations? I would suggest that Trethewey achieves a kind of investigation of the legacies not only of Black modernism literarily, but also figuratively through the use of varied poetic forms such as the persona form, particularly since persona poetry's fundamental formal function involves the transformation from an inanimate object into an animated and speaking poetic subject. Trethewey's ekphrastic practice creates a counter-archive of poems that provide a feminist or womanist perspective on archives of visual art largely created by white men of an elite economic class. Ekphrasis is an art form that feeds on other art forms, especially forms of image making, doesn't have a fixed form. But Trethewey's verbal translation of Belloc's camera work into set forms, quatrains, tercets, and couplets in poems such as the ekphrastic photograph of a bawd drinking Raleigh Wye fixes the reader's attention. She shifts our field of vision so that we focus on details that are often overlooked, widening our interpretive lens so that we look at the anonymous women that Belloc photographed differently. In so doing, her ekphrastic vision reveals what is appealing and appalling within the iconography of the female body and the particular iconicity of the nude Black female body in painting, photography, and literary history. Ultimately, what I'd like to suggest is that Trethewey's ekphrasis pushes readers beyond traditional enclosures encompassing the body of visual, racial, and sexual knowledge of women, bodies that we learned through modernist legacies of visual art and literary culture, towards alternate empowering modes of apprehension. These intersecting forms of enclosure are racial, spatial, spectral, and temporal. I will argue that Trethewey's enclosures of form enable her to resist and reverse through an imaginative realm other restrictive enclosures, including the conditions of overexposure to which the female body within African American literary and visual culture has been subjected. In the opening of Belloc's Ophelia, Trethewey has, in Millet's painting Ophelia dies face up, eyes, mouth open as if caught in the gas of her last word or breath, flowers and reeds growing out of the pound, floating on the surface around her. What Trethewey does with this tradition ekphrastically in her poem is reverse the tradition of the death of the tragic mulatto by having at the very end of Belloc's Ophelia of the book, through her narrative form, a different form of enclosure that Ophelia breaks out of. At the end, Belloc takes her photo, her brow furrowed as she looks out to the left, past all of them. Imagine her, Trethewey asks, a moment later, after the flash, blinding, stepping out of the frame, wide-eyed into her life. But not so fast. What I'd like to argue is that one of the ways that Trethewey works before she achieves this kind of stepping out of the form and out of the frame of Belloc's visage is through, actually paradoxically, the kind of formal enclosures and formal strictures that I would argue tie her to the legacy of syllabic enclosure that one can find in poets such as Marion Moore. Trethewey's formalism reflects the gendered politics of affect and the enclosures of narrative and poetic forms, since she has frequently explained that she employs poetic form as a tool of restraint in order to corral difficult emotions, often linked to traumatic experience. Quote, Trethewey here, if I didn't use formal constraints, if I didn't allow for silences around certain things in the book, the pages would be dripping wet, soaked with my tears when a reader picked them up, end quote. Here, I could hear some of you chuckling. Trethewey's effective metaphor draws upon not the discourses of modernism, but the discourses of sentimentalism, prevalent in 18th and 19th century English literature. This is no mere coincidence, since although Belloc's photographs were taken at the turn of the 20th century, most of the epistolary and narrative conventions of Belloc's Ophelia owe a formal debt to epistolary and sentimentalist fiction such as Samuel Richardson's canonical Clarissa, or History of a Young Lady. Still other coincidences abound. Richardson employed fictional letters to develop female character portraits. Trethewey uses the verse epistle form throughout Belloc's Ophelia to converge with her standalone ekphrastic poems to portray her composite character's complexity. Richardson's heroine, like Ophelia, is trapped by turns in a brothel. 18th century British law classified brothels as quote-unquote disorderly houses, a juridical and historical detail that Trethewey may or may not have been alluding to when she said that, quote, she felt she'd been given, as all Americans have been given, a very disorderly history, end quote, and also that she, quote, saw poetry as a way to make order out of them. Still, it seems logical that she would turn to form's pattern predictability in the face of its antidote, disorder in what is inherently unpredictable. Perhaps it's more accurate to affirm that ordered or enclosed form contours more than it controls the archive. It contours emotion. Trethewey's emotional intelligence, then, enacts the aesthetic distance necessary for not only ekphrastic and poetic clarity, but for a kind of relationship that is oblique to the archive. Trethewey is often celebrated for her use of a variety of traditional Steinway forms, and although the sonnet and villanelle are considered forms of European origins, the form I'd like to turn to now that Trethewey uses is the haiku. The haiku is a Japanese form composed and performed not only in the hemispheric East for long periods of time before English writers adapted them. Thus, Trethewey's formal range is a geographic range that spans beyond the American South, to which she is usually affiliated to include other parts of the globe. In fact, the word globe appears thrice in one of 15 epistolary poems in Belloc's Ophelia. Ophelia writes her former teacher, Constance Wright, recalling fondly the globe for the corner of the room, end quote, in their rural schoolhouse upon her discovery of one inside the brothel's library. She recalls her mentor spinning the globe back and forth across the expanse of blue, bridging a gap between Africa and Atlanta. The globe renders the world, quote, larger and smaller. The world traveled no place so distant that I couldn't dream myself there, end quote. The sense of external, internal, or psychic migration is enhanced by the fictional letter poems Ophelia describes in her journey seasonally in an ecological metaphor that expresses her sense of emotional and embodied growth. She explains in her first stanza, at last we are near breaking the season, shedding our coats, the gray husk of winter. And then at the end, she moves to claim that, quote, I feel what trees must, budding, green sheath splitting, skin that no longer fits. The haiku provides a more empowering form of disrobing than what occurs within Mahogany Hall, where she tries not to be exposed, quote, though naked, to learn, quote, how to wear skin like a garment, seamless. And again, here we can hear the haunting of the modernist surface in skin that Trethewey is drawing upon in her use of haiku. Formally speaking, Ophelia's effective expansion is enclosed within the most compressed form in the book. The 575 syllabic limit of the 3-line haiku totals only 17 syllables. Paradoxically, this closed form opens. The two M dashes that both separate and conjoin, must, budding, and splitting skin, suggests the kind of rupture and departure that opens up new possibilities for Ophelia in terms of her emotional and physical geography. Her departure behind the confines of the district, behind Storyville's legally enforced residential and racialized enclosures, then, reads as even more daring. We learn in a subsequent letter poem that Ophelia is harassed, arrested, and more than likely molested by police who detain her on the street after she visits a sick sister, the euphemism for her fellow sex worker in a sanatorium. The tension between breaking out of the enclosures of physical space, the narration of the spatial move within energizing enclosures of poetic form, and the continual need to shield against distorting forms of intimate exposure animates Belloc's Ophelia. And I'd like to turn now, actually, to a moment of Trethewey's reading from Belloc's Ophelia that I think is striking in talking about one of the legacies of primitivism and modernism in the way that Trethewey chooses to read Belloc's Ophelia. The Joel Collins Smith Museum had only been open for a few years when Trethewey hosted a reading for it. Was hosted at a reading for it on January 28, 2008 at Auburn University. The bulk of poems Trethewey read on that wintry Alabama afternoon would later appear in Thrall. Belloc's Ophelia, the poem she recited first, was one in which she shared with her audience first its poem's origins, recalling that, quote, "I began writing this poem after seeing for the first time a photograph by E.J. Belloc. When I first saw one of his photographs, I was struck by how much the photograph looked like a painting that I had seen, the painting by John Everett Millay of Ophelia, which had been on the cover of my 9th grade Hamlet text. So in this poem, there's a lot of ekphrasis going on. It's not just the response to Millay's painting, but also to Belloc's photograph, and also to Hamlet and Ophelia. Trethewey's forms of enclosure, I hear, enable us to narratively imagine the sights and scenes of archival mediation that produce her ekphrastic aesthetics. But I'd like us to consider why Trethewey first carefully narrates her initial and subsequent encounters with these different images of women made iconic with visual and literary art, and then chooses not to show them. Trethewey says that one of the conference coordinators, the symposium was entitled Ekphrasis, Word, and Image, and Trethewey moves from the conjunction and to words as image, rendering her words as image and by not providing images, claiming that, quote, "I decline to provide images because I'm hoping that the poems themselves help you see the painting, even if I'm asking you to see other things in the painting," end quote. On the one hand, what Trethewey does is provide a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand that Aristotle himself may approve of, right? She enlivens these objects and animate things through vivid description, the doing of something to life as a kind of imitation, bringing through her poem to the mind's eye the absence, which only takes place through the absence of the optical triggers of the photographic objects that were her ekphrastic triggers, what captivated her mind's eye. So her practice implies what Keith Leonard would argue is that, quote, "neither photography or painting alone can deliver insights into self-knowledge made available by the work of poetics and the work of the archive, which brings them all together." On the other hand, I would argue that her refusal as a mixed-race woman herself to show images when she's reading poems from Belloc's Ophelia is related to limiting exposure and limiting the legacy of primitivism with the archive. Now, Trethewey didn't show the images, but I'm going to show a couple of images from Belloc's Ophelia. This particular image is by Belloc. The next image is the book cover of Belloc's Ophelia that Trethewey uses. Although she begins with Millay's Ophelia, I think it's striking that the decision that it's made of all of Belloc's images is that, of course, that Trethewey chooses to use one that models a kind of Victorian ethos and sentimentalist tradition and pictorial tradition that I referenced earlier in my talk. And this issue of whether it's Belloc's Ophelia or Trethewey's Ophelia, whose Ophelia is it? Who's appropriating whom is one that I think can be talked about in Q&A. Even in terms of its titling, Trethewey doesn't mention Lee Friedlander, right, who himself is the reason that Trethewey first came in the encounter of the book Storyville Portrait. She didn't come first to Belloc's plates. She came to Friedlander's reproduction of those plates in the book. And that's a kind of elision, an archival elision, that I think is interesting in the way that Trethewey writes in the book. Now, if we look here for Millay's Ophelia, the one that's referenced, we can see that Trethewey, of course, is referencing white skin. But by the time you get to kind of E.J. Belloc's actual image, the ability to read that skin is white is completely related to spatial and juridical forms of enclosure. The last image that I'd like to talk about in Trethewey before we move to look at Giscombe is Monet's Olympia. Olympia makes no mention anywhere in the pages of Belloc's Ophelia. But in archival drafts of Trethewey's versions of the poem, there are references not only to that Olympia, where in earlier versions of Countess P's advice for new girls, the Countess tells Ophelia to think of that trollop Olympia when you pose. And she also has in an earlier draft version a statement to Ophelia that says, ignore the walls enclosing in on themselves. Think only of abundance, of your swelling purse. These temporal and other kinds of figurative enclosures that get elided and get kind of erased in the revisionary process, I think, make us think about what's at stake in historical and archival projects by contemporary African-American writers who are going back to pictorial works and also spatial works in earlier periods of modernism. I want, on time. I want, in the interest of time, to jump now to the last third of my talk in looking at Giscombe's particular relationship to the archive. 3. A legacy of avant-garde Black modernism, C.S. Giscombe's cartographic and perspective poetics. The past is watery. The past is treed. The past is a list of houses. The past is a fat metaphor sitting down for dinner. I was sitting down, but not for dinner. Seated in place, yes. I shouldn't have mentioned dinner. You all are probably ready to get out of here. I was seated in place, yes, but I was also mobile, driving down a road that curved like a crooked letter C along a quadrant of a map of British Columbia. I flew to Victoria, then boarded a turboprop plane to Prince George, and after a night's rest, drove at dawn to the sparsely populated sawmill town of Giscombe. And I'd like to pause here to say that I'm indebted to the Modernist Studies Association for that trip, because I actually took that trip in right after the end of the 2010 Modernist Conference in Victoria. I drove there to conduct research on poetry and the racialization of place. I drove there having wanted to, quote, drive out to the edge, out to the invisibility there, out to all that up there in Canada that took place up there. As the poet wrote in the book I had read, with its metaphors, its maps, and slices of maps that I'm going to talk about in this last section of my talk. I flew to Victoria to look through the British Columbia archives and to learn more about Giscombe's past. I drove to Giscombe, British Columbia, to learn more also about the small town's present, and to look for the waterways, trees, trails, houses, and roads, and post office detailed in the poet's meditations on geography and genealogy, Giscombe Road, a long poem, and Into and Out of Dislocation, a travel memoir. I drove there alone. Giscombe Road is a known road, the author wrote. Known to whom, I wondered, after driving for miles and miles with only green-gray caribou, pines and blue-gray Canada sky for company. What took place up there worth knowing, and when? All that up is not only a location, more important, it's an orientation. In terms of geographic imaginaries of Black modernist history and its legacies, despite the reality of slavery's existence in Canada in the 18th century, I understood Giscombe's up to also signal out, as in out from slavery into the U.S., up into freedom and the upper Northwest, as in out from under or along the Underground Railroad of the past, itself not an out, but an above, and up there too, as in the tradition of taking it out, in jazz, in avant-garde jazz specifically, as in Nathaniel Mackey's term of outishness that has been used by him in earlier works. The emphasis on the outness of place in Giscombe's oeuvre is suggested by other titles of his books, At Large, Here, Postcards, and Prairie Style. In the spirit of Giscombe's style, I begin by talking about cartography and a racial and gender past by figuratively routing the reader through my own journey along the stretch of the Yellowhead Highway, which you can see here. And I did actually Google map it, but I also tried to use Giscombe's book itself as my own personal archive to orient me through that research. Giscombe Road is ostensibly about the, quote, constellation of places named directly or indirectly for John Robert Giscombe, end quote, and the persistent invisible presence of this miner and explorer who was born in Jamaica in 1831, traveled as a young man during the Black California migration, discovered a short route around the rapids into the Arctic watershed, now and back. This discovery is now known as, quote, the Giscombe Portage Trail, and you can see a part of the trail there on the screen. And its discovery is qualified by quotation marks in the text of Giscombe Road, repeatedly. John Robert Giscombe ultimately flourished there, as they say, in 19th century British Columbia. The spelling and pronunciation of the surname Giscombe, it's spelled without the B and sometimes with it, so if you see the difference in my slides, it's not a typo. I guess to be or not to be is still the question. Giscombe's transnational sojourn between Portland and Paris, Jamaica, Britain, the United States, and Canada are some of the places where the Giscombes have spread. The possibility of a familial connection, a blood lineage, a kinship connection, or formal relationship between Giscombes across nation states, regions, waterways, and centuries animates the kind of avant-garde legacy of modernism and the exploratory and innovative forms of writing and framing a poetic space by Giscombe that I see at stake here. What's interesting to me about kind of the legacy of blood lineage and modernist thought that Giscombe is picking up on, and I would argue resisting, is that where kind of Langston Hughes claims a blood lineage and lineage in I've Known Rivers, Giscombe's own work with Giscombe Portage Trail and the rivers and roads that Giscombe is linked to is always having a skeptical, one might argue, a more postmodernist skeptical relationship to that lineage. The pioneer Giscombe was perhaps the poet Giscombe's paternal ancestor, or perhaps not. And this kind of skepticism can be seen in a quote from Giscombe's travel memoir. I've been overeager to distance John R from the possibility of descendants, Giscombe said. Perhaps especially since I was surely fair, I wasn't one. I wanted my man to stay beyond the capture of descendants. And the lack of photographs, here's the complete reversal and split than what we saw in Trethewey, the abundance of photographs of the women who worked in the sex work industry. But in Giscombe's case, the lack of photographs rendered him conveniently inaccessible through any normal channels. There were no bloodlines, hidden or unhidden, no family resemblance. Instead, he was a series of references, and more important, he was landscape itself and the way through landscape both. A definitive landscape of the Black North, and beyond that, he was the past. Again, you can see the sense of a retrospective where landscape becomes not just a way to see the past, but to be the actual past in Giscombe's work. The purest and most distant and perfect self with intact borders, an island in England. I quoted the passage from Giscombe's memoir at length because it encapsulates some of my core concerns about his particular brand of a legacy that connects him to modernist linkages. And that's the role of the writer as cartographer, right? There's a kind of cognitive mapping that Jameson mentions, but here I would like to think about literal mapping and plays with mapping that Giscombe engages in when he's navigating a racialized Canadian past, as well as his present familial mapping of a familial genealogy, both before and beyond the place of the photograph, charting the landscape as both verb and noun in terms of race, gender, and reproduction, and also in terms of concepts such as the border, passe gloria anzaldua, in terms of self and nation. Giscombe gives voice to the concept of edges, ledges, and lineages, historical and geographic and poetic location. An embodied geography often takes the shape, or as it were, the place of the performance utterance. In Giscombe's words, it is sound that carries shape. According to Giscombe, his journey on the Giscombe Portage Trail here marks the way that Giscombe, the name sound, is traced across the Giscombe Portage Trail. Giscombe not only reads maps such as this that's pictured on the screen, but he also rewrites them. Thus, Giscombe Road and Prairie Style both present specific poetic devices that enable the kind of extraterritorial imaginative travel that Jahan Ramazani usually delineates as a poetics of transnational identity that links up with transnational networks of modernism. Particularly, this is present in Giscombe's creative meditation on the aesthetic aspects of maps, which we'll see in just a minute, representational plane, and in his formally exploratory play. Giscombe's transnational poetry of play and poetry of place, I aim to make clear, shows why poetry and Black modernist legacies within poetry matter to contemporary debates in modernist studies and in African diasporities as well. Giscombe's perspective poetics are tied to John Robert Giscombe's profession as a miner, explorer, and landowner. And so, in so doing, Giscombe indexes the socio-political where of race. If race has a where, if its dimensions are socio-spatial, then race is also multi-scalar. That these BC locales named after John R. Giscombe include a rail, a navigable waterway, a Portage Trail area that you can see here, a regional park, a canyon, a town, historical site, and an elementary school reflect the varied range and scales of spaces identified with him, as well as the way that the world is staked out by names. One contradiction as it pertains to the politics of naming, nation, and spatial regimes in Giscombe's work, as well as in the naming and Giscombe's tracing of the lineage of naming, of naming, is that Giscombe's Portage Trail is a protected area, as you can see here on the screen, but who's actually getting protected, and who is protected from whom? On the one hand, the naming of the trail after Giscombe reflects what the late queer poet and scholar Melvin Dixon attests to as evidence within Black literary culture of speech acts and, quote, spatial images that invert assumptions about place and endow language with the power to reinvent geography and identity, end quote. Such that, and I quote again here, Dixon, conquered spaces, imagined havens, and places of refuge have produced not only a deliverance from slavery to freedom, but more important, a transformation from rootlessness to rootedness, end quote. But John Robert Giscombe wasn't a slave. As Giscombe points out, he's actually outside of certain networks, the national crises that might reasonably be connected to him, slavery in Jamaica, the Civil War in the United States, occurred before his lifetime or in places far from where he lived and worked. He went for the gold rush. True, Giscombe's roots are tied to labor and migration. He most likely worked his way from California to Jamaica via Panama, but his routes are not neatly or necessarily mapped through enforced migration and unpaid labor. And in fact, the articles in local British Columbia newspapers mark him as a quote-unquote pioneer. Thus, on the other hand, John Robert Giscombe's pioneering, quote-unquote, conquering space of the waterway seems to reflect Said's notion of what exists at the root of imperialism. Quote, a geographical violence through which virtually every space in the world is explored, charted, and finally brought under control, end quote. Specifically, the naming of the Giscombe Portage Trail as such displaces indigenous naming practices, spatial history, and culture of travel along the waterway by the Tlatli-Tina First Nations tribe. The portage was first used by their tribe as a trade route for harvesting plants and animals in 1863, and in fact, a guide from that tribe led Giscombe and his mining partner, Henry McDame, for the Bahamas across the trail. Tlatli-Tina means where two rivers meet, or in a connection to the theme of this conference, where they may converge. What are we to make of this place where two rivers meet in Giscombe's work, where peoples meet, where what in Marnice Phillips might call displace, the space between? What to make of the name of the place and the placement of the name on these rivers? Or how does Giscombe remake such diasporic displacement? One way Giscombe remakes that displacement is by placing himself there continually. I was always going to Canada, the next country, Giscombe remarks. Years before, when he had talked to his father about taking a trip to Canada, his father said, yes, way up in Canada. He countered that it wasn't all that far and told me, I'm quoting Giscombe here on the screen, that once he'd almost driven there impulsively. When they'd been in Sault Ste. Marie, and he'd seen a road sign for the place that said it was 90 miles. But my mother, he said, had nixed the trip. One of the telling features about how relation figures in this passage is through a time-space continuum. The mother fixes the trip by getting on the phone and saying that, and reminding Giscombe's father that her grandfather had never had anything good to say about his brother. And she reminded me about her considered opinion that long-lost relatives should stay lost. If you run into any Giscombes up there, she said, just don't give them this address. And as Thanksgiving approaches, or not, we can certainly think of our relationships or relatives that we may or may not want to remain lost. These long-lost relatives that aren't too far away, who, according to Giscombe's mother's maternal wisdom, should remain lost, which is also far, far and away, suggests two different readings of legacies of modernism and particularly on the Harlem Renaissance. Instead of looking for the kind of interior spaces or trying to kind of claim linkages and unities with Black families, this kind of linkage that Giscombe is drawing out creates a kind of distance within them. Here in this passage, masculinity is aligned with adventure, a desire and willingness to confront the wilderness or the West. Giscombe and his father both go impulsively, his father says, or desire to go further into the upper Northwest, whereas femininity, more specifically Giscombe's mother, is spatially defined by an unwillingness in her ability to travel beyond the confines of an often restricted domestic or private space, a reluctance to engage or be on the range. Giscombe's mother, recall, nixed the trip. Significantly, the boundary that's relational is also spatial. Don't give any Giscombes, not the phone number, although this correspondence is not correspondence by letter, but by address, right? She says in the conversation. But I want to push a little bit on this dichotomy to suggest that there are ways that this passage potentially reflects the mother's spatial authority and resists particularly gendered roles that might delimit her agency, spatial and otherwise. And this is a kind of distinction, I would argue, than the kind of delimited spatial roles that we might see in some of the Harlem Renaissance novels by Jessie Fawcett or Nella Larson and others. If we think about kind of Helga Crane and her eventual enclosures, spatially speaking. For example, in contrast to the role of women traditionally defined in terms of caretaking and becoming the linchpin of connection for the family, particularly the family, she's the one who erects the boundary lines, the separation, the rupture in family, who insists on exclusion. The trip took place in 1988, Giscombe notes in his memoir, and it was in the 1980s, after all, that Dorothy Height of National Association of Negro Women fame created, quote, the National Black Family Union, which upheld the, quote, heterosexual nuclear race family, as well as extended families, which I would argue that Giscombe's work obliquely critiques. Thus, one irony within Giscombe's literary and lineage project is that despite his years-long search for his namesake or near-namesake ancestral kin in Canada and elsewhere, the Giscombe Road is less an exploration of the politics of identity and Black identity specifically that we may have seen in modernism, but more an exploration through a Black British Columbia subject of a poetic cartography of the fictions of place, as the scholar Peter Hudson has suggested. Giscombe's poetic narrative uses actual factual maps to render places palpable, as intimate as the body, and yet as abstract, surface level as distinctive as a productive nation or region state. The fact of the map is a fiction. It's a particularly useful one with intentional punning on Jameson here, but in terms of cognitive mapping, but it's an especially artful one in C.S. Giscombe's hands. Maps are metaphors for place in Giscombe's. Maps make propositions about place. Maps mask the propositions that they make. Giscombe's reproduction here of a variety of topographic, topological, and choreographic maps within the pages of Giscombe Road essentially renders the placement of orientation, namely the cartographer's omniscient eye, as a geographical hierarchical position that's subverted. Here, Giscombe Road includes, among several maps, one that was commissioned the year when British Columbia became incorporated and joined into the Federation of Canada. Or, to put another way, the year that the region formally enters the nation state. This signals the oft-discussed connection between map making and nation building enterprises. Instead of the map of the empire, Giscombe gives us the map as the empire. In contrast to the pun on the Empire Strikes Back, Giscombe's poetry pushes in an innovative alternative direction. Can the poet's poetics of mapping strike back at or strike out beyond imperial impulses, beyond imperial influences, which are part of the legacies of British modernism? The poet's narrative of his trip also includes splicing of a map that seeks to alter the hierarchical positions of maps and render a spatial parody that attempts to place the reader, viewer, or the ground, or to ground them within the place of poetry. In fact, I would argue, as you can see on the slide here, that part of Giscombe's innovation is by formally dislocating maps into metaphors, literally, that are pictorialized here within his verse. Thus, for example, here, this splicing of an archival and contemporary map into units interspersed visually and structurally within lines of verse turn these lines into links as metaphors. The poet reminds the reader view here of metaphors as well as maps' rhetorical function. Thus, the cartographic line and the poetic line share corresponding longitude and latitude, and the verse form holds aesthetic and political implications for the future of Black modernism and its legacies. At the conclusion of this section of Giscombe Road, one of the long poem's narrators asks, what house disappeared into the description, which went last? Description and poetic narrative, like depiction in cartographic and ekphrastic visioning, performs a temporal and geospatial sleight of hand. Objects are lost in the landscape. Here and elsewhere, Giscombe likely provides an oblique reference to Elizabeth Bishop's, our late modernist, list of artfully mastered losses, including places and names, 3 loved houses, 2 cities, 2 rivers, and even a continent in her off-cited poem, One Art. In Giscombe's prairie style, Giscombe cites not only maps, but also moves to cite the lexical dimensions of placing of jazz through a kind of modernist legacy. Often, when scholars tend to speak of jazz and say jazz in modernist and diaspora studies, they're also implicitly saying or speaking race. Indeed, one legacy of both modernism and the Black arts movement is an almost stereotypical association made between Black arts writers and improvisatory lineation, word placement, and music, and above all else, jazz and blues. And in fact, Giscombe Road, he argues, and Prairie Style are both, quote, about the way that landscape is described, the language and landscape of jazz, and the gods of Dahomey. It's about Miles Davis's playing, Giscombe says, and about some of the stuff that gets talked over in Heart of Darkness and Invisible Man, end quote. But I would argue that Giscombe's creative rendering of maps and and archival use of dictionary entries that are pictured here in his work calls these landscapes and regions and spaces by which jazz is referenced in terms of Black masculinity into question. Here you have an image of a dictionary definition of the cornet. And this dictionary definition for cornet comes from Webster's Collegiate Dictionary of 1959. You'll note that the image included here, along with the definition, is phenotypically representing a young man, presumably of African descent. However, if you can see here, the fourth reference in the dictionary entry for the meaning for cornet is that of, quote, a young British cavalry officer of low rank, end quote. Also, you'll note that the figure of the Black male reed player as the prototypical icon of jazz is featured not only linguistically, but imagistically as well, through the inclusion of this entry. The year 1959 is significant, not only because of its link to modernist legacies of bebop-era jazz, but in a defining moment in jazz's evolution, particularly in terms of its turn for the avant-garde, but also because in Giscombe's memoir that we learned that 1959 was the first time that Giscombe ever traverses the borders of, or in his words, quote, crossed the bridge into Canada. Finally, when we consider that dictionaries, maps, and images are all bridges to meaning and borders, or one might say fortresses, of knowledge, mining, and production, the parallel relationship between cartography and lexicography as projects and practices of modernist empire that Giscombe is subsequently subverting is clearly, if paradoxically, obliquely evoked here. Despite the apparent source references, etymological and otherwise, I'd like to posit that Giscombe's process of exploratory poetics encourages us to reconsider the lineages connecting African American artistic cultures to the contemporary legacies of Black international modernism so that lines can be more easily drawn, not chiefly between racialized subjects and music making, but between poetics and map making. Of course, I'm not going to conclude by arguing that Giscombe writes jazz out of the transnational network of modernisms, but that he does revisit, like Trethewey, and attempt to revise set assumptions. He takes even the most archetypal African-American modernist and jazz affiliate poet, Langston Hughes, and demonstrates through his verse that not only does he transcribe sound, but prescribes both the mapping of rivers and the movement of sound through time and space across national, racial, and geographical boundaries. And here I want to move to look towards conclusion of one of the ways that he does this. This particular map, Giscombe drew himself, like it's a hand-drawn map, and I'd like to suggest that the kind of black-white binary here of the lines of the map and the actual lines that he draws is replicated in sound that gets fleshed out as a map in the visual space. You can't see it because it's the invisible white space. If you look back and forth, it's an inversion that actually mirrors the kind of journey, coincidentally or intertextually, that I took and that I mentioned at the beginning of my third section of my discussion of Giscombe. Giscombe Robe does not engage in a narratively impossible project of recovering and restoring John Robert Giscombe's lost voice. Instead, I would argue that it's considered through its innovative use of mapping, a reconsideration and representation of lost viewpoints of a mid-19th century Black migrants' relationship to mobility and place, one whose journey is not rooted in the experience of the Middle Passage, yet whose journey can still contribute to stories of territorial displacement in the African diaspora. In place of historical recovery projects that were part of the impulse of Black modernist legacy, I would argue that contemporary poets tend to question such recovery projects by using the archives differently and differentially. Thus, the use of poems and poem maps tend not to fit neatly within narratives of the archive that Giscombe creates. And in the interest of time, I will move to the very end. I begin my presentation, my journey with the audience, not by waiting in boat or water or canoe, as John Robert Giscombe and Henry McDane used as their modes of transport, nor by walking or bicycling on board a train, Giscombe's own preferred methods of transportation, but by taking the reader on this researcher's journey through a motor vehicle, driving in my rental car along a stretch of the Upper Fraser Road en route into the town of Giscombe. Thus, it's only fitting that I end where Giscombe himself navigates the reader, along the road out. Ultimately, Giscombe's poetics of mapmaking reminds readers of U.S.-centric African-American poetry to remember their North American neighbors further up along the northernmost road. His transformative meditation on place points to a promising future in the history and historiography of the connections between modernist and transnational legacies within Black poetics, one in which the interdisciplinary fields of African diaspora studies also inflects theories of global modernisms, global racial formations, and innovations in poetic form. As Giscombe phrases it, quote, "The road out is an inflection between houses on the road. The road out passes underneath shapes of light. The road out's fluid. It's shapely itself. It's the way around. On the road out, Black diasporic prosody and its Afro-modernist legacies find a new frontier." Thank you.
It's a wonderful talk, Meta. I really enjoyed it a lot and learned a lot.
Thank you.
So you mentioned in your talk about Trethewey's poetry that...
Could you speak into the mic? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I
Thank
don't know.
you.
Is it on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you talked about Trethewey's poetry and the fact that except for maybe one line or so, she mentions music or musical image. But my reading of the poem, or the way I look at this collection of poetry, is that it's an associative process where the music is found. When the reader reads the poetry, you think of New Orleans, you think of Storyville, therefore the music is in your head. So she's doing something different there by not necessarily formally referencing the music, except for that one line, but in the associative properties that we often associate with, you know, music in New Orleans and jazz and blues. That's where the music comes in.
I think that's a really great reading. Did you have a question in relationship to that?
Well, not a question in relationship to that. It was an observation, but I do have a question in terms of Belloc's Ophelia, in terms of looking at what Trethewey is doing with the notion of women's bodies and work. You know, her first collection was domestic work, and now we're talking about sex workers. So what do you see of the connection between domestic work and sex workers?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd love to answer that question. So one, I want to take the comment that you made about, the reason I said it was a great reading about talking about reading the music as an associative process is that one of my arguments, and the reason actually that tech people kept asking, are you using music, are you using music? I was like, absolutely not, is that there's no coincidence that for both Giscombe and Trethewey, there are ways that the music is present. I wasn't trying to say that music is, I mean, you can't talk about New Orleans without it being present, but that I see kind of one of the kind of contemporary turns is an insist on the pictorial, right? Because that kind of people tend to come to Black poetry and, you know, and with that, right? And come to Black expressive cultures with the phonic, so much so that the visual, right, and the optical gets kind of almost washed out. Now, to go back to kind of what she's doing and answer your question directly about the link between domestic work and sex work, what I would argue, and this is what's interesting, I would argue that kind of there's the creative work that Trethewey is engaged in, the kind of aesthetic distance that I referenced earlier in talking about Giscombe. In Trethewey, she's taking advantage of the historical distance, right, from both concerns during the height of the Harlem Renaissance about novels and texts that were representing prostitutes, right, as calling them at that time, sex workers. So she's taking, I would argue, advantage of that, and I'll be honest that that one of the questions I have, intentions that I haven't resolved in thinking through this work about kind of the relationship between domestic labor and sexual labor that she's implying, is to what extent is she complicit in certain kinds of forms of appropriation, right, in her use of the archive? To what extent is her own domestic work, right, the interior space of her work as a writer, right, being kind of implicated in the way that she references the work of the sex workers that are photographed, right? So that's not it's an answer to your question, but it's also reframing your question in terms of thinking of domestic work, not only in terms of Black women domestics, right, which her first volume does focus particularly on, and even Thrall has that poem that already is auditory, at least. It's she's recited a lot in readings, the poem The Help, 1968, where she's referencing the Robert Frank photograph, right, of a Black woman domestic worker, and then reading against the biography of her mother. I would say that the kind of work and the kind of linkages that Trethewey is making there is to think about kind of postures of the body, the way that we read Black female bodies, and how there's actually a link between the way that one might read Olympia or Edward Monet's Olympia and the way that might read a Robert Frank photograph, such that the kind of these depictions of the Black female body in terms of postures are postures that are often seen labor-wise as either being prone, right, like, or bending over, right? So that's one way to kind of make that linkage. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Yes, hi.
Ask a question because there's so many electrifying things that you presented. So thank you for this wonderful talk.
Thanks.
My question is, I was really struck when you talked about Trethewey saying that, and I think I heard you right, that when she leaves, if she were to leave the formal mode, she would wet, the page would be wet. Is that correct? And so I guess I'm wondering are you, I mean, I guess the sort of sense that I'm getting is that you're outlining two kinds of lineages. One that's very formally bound, and then another that's more open-ended. But then by the time we get to the end of the talk, I got this sense that you were really seeing them come together in some way. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how these forms or these alternate trajectories might coincide, and also, just as an add-on, where would you put Claudia Rankines in terms of her photo, video work? I mean, it's such an interesting trajectory here, so thank you.
Oh, thank you, and that's such a lovely question for a couple of reasons. I did do that deliberately. That's one of the things that I tend to, just the way both my poetic brain works, but also how my poetic reading brain works, is that that I was trying to draw two lineages, but I deliberately was doing exactly that, saying that kind of both of these lineages both could link back up to traditions. If we think about kind of Helene Johnson's sonnet to a Negro in Harlem, right? We have that particular legacy of a kind of a Black formalist modernist tradition, and that sonnet is a form of portraiture, right? That kind of but we also have at the same time you have the kind of modernist experimentation or late modernist experimentation of Tolson in a way that I think that it's easy to make these dichotomies. Oh, okay. Giscombe is to Tolson, as Trethewey is to Johnson. And the way that I see them coming together is through actually the domain of the visual, through kind of, which is why I talked about kind of I only briefly mentioned, because I wanted retrospective to be suggestive and not delimiting, right? That kind of this sense of the spectral, that each of these forms, right, in terms of formal choices, haunt each other, right? The formal choices that Giscombe makes, the formal choices that Trethewey makes. And in fact, this idea of Trethewey's work on the page as being open-ended and therefore more improvisatory and therefore more loose is one that I actually wanted to subvert and actually kind of counteract by thinking about kind of even ideas about control on the page, that one could make a reverse argument by saying that kind of Giscombe is actually landscaping the page innovatively in a way that renders a kind of representation as a formal problem and an issue that he's attempting to resolve through a control of the page space, right? So part of my argument actually, and which is why I read and included that quote from one of Trethewey's interviews and linked it to this sentimentalist tradition, is that one of the things that tends to frustrate isn't quite the word I'm looking for. Trouble is a better way. Trouble me about the way in which Trethewey's work tends to be received, because she works so deeply with autobiography, is that there's this conflation between the autobiographical persona in her works and even kind of what she's saying in the interview. And so, like, I would argue that kind of this idea that she says, okay, effectively, I needed to have these type forms because I needed this emotional control, right? I'm not questioning, I don't want to go into issues of authenticity, so I'm not questioning or suggesting that she is being disingenuous. What I am attempting to say is that kind of narration of control, right, is an aesthetic decision as opposed to a personal one, but it's read more often as a personal decision. Now, how does that relate to Claudia Rankine? What's great about that is there's an interview where Trethewey is talking about kind of what for her, who she turns to look at in terms of aesthetic mentors and models, right? And Claudia Rankine is one of the poets that she turns to. She speaks of one of her ekphrastic poems. Now, which are very, very, very different. But if you think about, since you asked me a question, if you think about Rankine's "Don't Let Me Be Lonely" in American Lyric, right? The kind of intense interiority, right? Intense interiority that her work with the prose poem represents, at the same time that she's doing something that both links up with Giscombe on the one hand in his inclusion of these maps and photographs of maps and splicings in his work, but and on the other hand links up with Trethewey in terms of the kind of interiority of her poems and of the lyric, is something that I think links those together. So what I would say to kind of answer your question even more fully is that what I'm trying to do is think about confluences and divisions as things that are ways of perceiving the work, right? Not necessarily only of ways that are intrinsic to the work. Does that answer that?
Yeah, and in other words, you don't want to fall into these binaries.
Exactly.
You know? And the archive you defined, I love, it's just a mobile, geographic, embodied, which is amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah,
thank you so much. And in fact, I had a play on binaries. If you notice with my PowerPoint, this is PowerPoint geekdom. The first third of it was black and white because Trethewey's doing so much with the black-white binary. And the second third was blue because of rivers, but it was also to suggest pictorially those kind of binaries, right, that I'm attempting to subvert and that are more fluid. Thank you.
I don't know if this is, it is on.
I can hear you.
I'm just going to ask, there's a longer version of this. I'm going to ask the really, really short version, which is just, I'm wondering if you've considered, whether it's even worthwhile considering the notion, like what Brett Edwards might call the counter archive in respect to some of this work, particularly Giscombe, but even Trethewey too, and whether that's, anyway, that's the short version.
Oh, sure. No, it's, and I actually mentioned, I cited Edwards when I mentioned counter archive earlier in my talk. So one thing that I would think about how that kind of the idea of counter archive vis-a-vis Edwards works in relationship to thinking of either Giscombe or Trethewey is through his notion of practice, right? And kind of diasporic practice is one of the ways that kind of counter-archival practices take place, but also through the notion of kind of the limits of translation, right? One of the things that I could do is link these up because they are both English-speaking writers, right? Giscombe was born in the Midwest, Trethewey in the South, and so their archival practices are not in the way where kind of for Edwards, he's going to look at writers who are in French or writers who are working in other linguistic domains, whereas for both Giscombe and for Trethewey, they're looking at archives that are, for them, in the English language, right? And so some of that, I would argue, links up to a notion of a practice that's actually limited, linguistically speaking, but not necessarily as limited optically speaking, right? So I think that's one way that I would suggest that there's an engagement with counter-archival practices.